Okay, Tom, so we have another Konami remake using Unreal Engine 5, which is Silent Hill 2 from the Bloober team. So I do have a lot of experience with MGS3, somewhat less experience with Silent Hill 2, so I don't have a ton of reference in the original to go back on, but I think Silent Hill 2 is probably one of the better horror games out there in terms of reaching a certain kind of atmosphere, which was aided by the PS2's impressive bandwidth and the ability to display a ton of fog on screen, which is obviously maybe not quite as severe here. But I think the question is, does this do right by the original game in terms of achieving that kind of atmosphere? Does it have that kind of oppressive, abandoned Silent Hill feel to it?
It sure does. I'm just like you, honestly, that I didn't get into the original Silent Hill 2 as much as most people because it was like a very early title for PS2.
Right.
I think that really hit a chord for a lot of people. On top of it being, a masterstroke in atmosphere building. Visually speaking, it's got this nightmarish, dreamlike quality, which people have always loved. And they're going for a faithful remake, but less so than MGS Delta. The Bloober
Right.
team are going a little bit harder to innovate and add bits and chop and change to make it kind of work for a modern audience, I think.
Okay, all right. One of the things I actually really liked, speaking of the atmosphere, is
Yeah.
just the game's heavy use of volumetric fog. I think it's a great upgrade on the 2D alpha that they used to supplement the fog before on PS2. And I think it actually critically here, because you have full camera control in this remake, it actually
Yeah.
holds up quite nicely at all angles, or at least it appears to. And it tends to fall in this very deliberate kind of heavy way across the environment, which I also quite liked. That looked pretty satisfying to me, and that also indicates that they, even though it does obscure the player view, and maybe some players will be annoyed by the fact that there's just overwhelming fog everywhere, I think it does capture the spirit of that PS2 original quite effectively. So I definitely agree with you there. One thing, though, that I did note with this preview footage is the Unreal Quadrifecta, as I'd call it, and its presence or absence. So to me, that's Lumen GI, Lumen Reflections, Virtual Shadow Maps, and nanite geometry. So personally, looking through this footage, because we do have access to about 30 minutes of B-roll here, I'm seeing strong evidence of Lumen GI in the way the game is lit, because we see distinctive pockets of shade that do have some instability in them, but aren't showing the kinds of screen space errors or relative lack of definition that we'd probably see if this was just SSAO. And there's super consistent lighting across environments, especially in indirectly lit areas, which are very hard normally to light. For lumen reflections, those are clearly visible in the puddles. When reflected details off screen, with one curious detail we'll touch on a little bit later. And I'm not seeing geometric pop in too much, so it could be using nanite. Certainly if it's using VSMs, it's likely using nanite. But the effective draw distance in the game is kind of makes it hard to see too far ahead of you. So I guess, what is your opinion on the way those UE5 lighting features appear to come together in this game?
Well, it is a definite lock for lumen reflections. And
Right.
there's actually, it will vary by the mode you use, but lumen reflections are included regardless of visuals 30 FPS mode or the performance
Okay.
60 FPS mode. So that's a lock, and I agree, yeah, totally, that all the sort of signs of lumen are there. There's the sort of SSR fallback to them. If anything falls out of screen space, lumen kind of is there as well. So it's kind of like a hybrid. We have a lumen AO or GI.
Right.
That's confirmed for just the 30 FPS quality mode.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that is a really, really effective touch, I think. But oddly enough, I didn't notice much of a difference in flipping between the two modes. It was
really?
like, I was looking for differences, but that was mainly outside. I think if I was to be in an interior, that would have stood out a lot more.
Okay.
So,
Okay, interesting.
in terms of UE5 features, those are the two. Like that, the Lumen is the main bit, I think.
Right. Sure. I think for me, one interesting thing with those lumen reflections, they look a little bit different here than in some other games we've seen recently, because normally with lumen, what we're seeing is software lumen, and the reflections in software lumen have this kind of weird, blobby, artifacty appearance because they're actually based on signed distance fields, not traditional meshes, not traditional polygonal meshes. And when we do look at off-screen detail in those lumen reflections here, doesn't look very SDF-y at all to me. They look like normal meshes. And there's one particular moment where you can clearly see that the lumen tech they are using is resolving these fine metal bars very well, where it's not jagged, it's not blobby, and it actually resembles a polygonal metal bar. There's also some footage from the State of Play a couple months ago that clearly shows off a tree that looks very normal, and again, not SDF-y, where trees and foliage and other titles that are using software lumen, like in Hellblade 2, they look very, very different and much cruder when you do strip back that SSR layer. And also, Bloober has done some work, I believe, with Layers of Fear. That was also a hardware lumen title.
Yeah, I agree that the reflection quality was much higher. Like, it looked so crisp that the details you could make out in the puddles across the floor, because it's all like drizzly when you get into Silent Hill, and you can see so much of the street signs and everything kind of just reflected back. There is a fidelity there, which is surprising.
Yeah, it does look really good. But one concern I do have that primarily revolves around the game's use of lumen, it seems, is image quality. Because if you look at the first major scene where you're kind of stepping out into the world, you're in that car parking lot, and the scene is just kind of boiling all over the place, which I think is a combination of lumen GI and lumen reflections operating in a scene with basically no direct lighting, like a lot of Silent Hill. It's all indirectly lit. Yeah. And when we do get into the forest area, at least from this footage, it looks like all the shadowed regions in the bushes and trees are super unstable and flickery, which almost makes you wish for like DLSS 3.5 ray reconstruction on consoles, but obviously we don't have that. So I guess, what do you make of image quality throughout the demo? I think it might be a bit different for you because you were playing that 60 FPS mode, and presumably that's operating at a lower resolution, but also you don't get maybe as much artifacts in the GI presentation because you don't get lumen GI apparently.
That's true.
Did you feel that image quality was okay, or do you think it's like among one of the kind of more challenged titles we've seen recently, AAA titles we've seen recently in terms of image quality?
I was very happy with the image quality overall.
Okay.
That wasn't. I was worried because I by default booted up on the 30 FPS mode, and I couldn't quite handle it, to be honest.
Really? Okay.
It was I think for whatever reason, between the turbulence of the camera movement, the shake, and the very restrictive field of view, it was putting my head in a worse space than I wished. So I was like, at the very least, I can help this by bumping it to 60. I believe it stands to reason that they would use dynamic resolution on this, but I didn't notice a visible decrease in image quality between the two modes.
Really?
And
Okay.
I think doubling your frame rate does help with this, because the amount of pixels per
You're getting more
per
temporal
second.
data to work with, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. Temporal data. Pixels per second. It makes a lot of sense perceptually, even if when we do like still shots, we can scrutinize it and pick it apart. So it'll be interesting to see that when we grab a still frame from 60 FPS mode.
Okay.
Image quality, great. Like I had no qualms with it. I think I was more than happy to play it that way.
Okay. And performance is mostly stable 60, or where is it landing at the moment?
I wish, but it is very early. It's a very early
It's
build.
It's early.
Yeah.
Not quite so much.
It was, so they, I guess to describe what I saw, it was from the start of the game up until you have your first encounter with Pyramid Head. And if you remember sort of the general layout of the flow of the game between those points, it's pretty much matched exactly, like the beat for beat. You go through the same puzzles, the same bits up to that, and all the same sort of jump scare moments are still there. But you start off kind of going through that woodland path, very linear. You can't really deviate at all. Then into the town, then into the apartment blocks. In the sort of woodland area, I noticed it dropping to about, it was definitely sub 60, and very aggressively sub 60. I would say 50, or maybe dipping into the 40s, just a guess, but we'll see. And then when you get into the town, it's 60 again, with maybe one or two minor drops. And then when you get into the apartment block, the apartments are just like, okay, 60, no problem at all. So it was specifically the area right near a church, like a graveyard bit, with loads of volumetric fog everywhere. Like it was really ramped up in that spot. And that's where I switched to the performance mode, and I thought, oh my god, this is not quite where it needs to be yet. But then the rest of the game was great, and I was having a blast with it. So yeah, very happy with the rest. But optimization wise, that was okay.
The last thing I really wanted to touch on, now that we've gone over basically all the graphical elements of the game in some detail, is the combat, because I know that this has been very controversial since they debuted their combat trailer some months ago, because to me, and I mean, you can push back on this as much as you like, but to me, the melee animations looked a little okay. I mean, they looked a little bit suboptimal in some cases. It looks like you might have to adjust your position a bit in combat, slightly awkward ways. And then the gunplay, I noticed the gun kicks back a bit too slowly. To me, it should be sharper. The muzzle flash doesn't have any effect on the scene lighting, seemingly no effect on the character lighting, and it decays a little bit slowly, so you're seeing that muzzle flash for like maybe half a second when it really should just be on there for a few frames, and it should be a bright and really explosive flash, I think, to really sell that impact. Then when you're fighting Pyramid Head in this footage, the movement of your player character relative to Pyramid Head looks a little bit weird, and then when you do hit his metal head covering, it clips badly into his clothing in a way that I don't typically see in modern games. Now, I know that combat was not a huge part of the original. Here, I think it's a bigger part of the game, but obviously I haven't played it, and you have played it, so am I off base? Does the combat work better on a pad than it does on my studio display screen here, or is it an area that you think needs improvement? Like, does it actually feel good?
It doesn't feel... It's not a combat-based game, right?
Right.
I think... There is an element of this being Silent Hill 2, you're desperately trying to avoid combat. Well, you know, you're very limited in what what you can get away with. You have like a crowbar and limited ammunition. Gunplay was never really, you know, the thing that they were encouraging. So in a weird way, it's almost like it's simulating the balance of that. But on the other hand, they have competition in the form of Resident Evil 2 Remake and all the stuff Capcom's doing with their own survival horror series.
Those are hugely remade in terms of the combat. It's just like a world apart from the originals, right?
Yeah. So that is an example of, I think, pitch perfect example of how you should balance that. But, you know, there's a difference in the vibe of Resident Evil with the zombie-based stuff and what Silent Hill is doing, which is a bit more psychological, lots of dark corners, build up of tension, and a lot more of that. I think mechanically, you're right. Like, this is not like the ideal way you should have shooting mechanics work, and the muzzle flash stuff is weird because the flashlight that you carry around the rest of the time does cast environmental shadows. So there's things they could do to make that better. The clipping as well, like when you're facing against Pyramid Head right at the end, it doesn't feel very satisfying to land that hit. I'm sure you noticed in the B-roll, it's a bit sort of lumping, and there's not much to it. So that's strange. What I will say about the combat generally, though, is that they have improved it, obviously, compared to the PS2 version. They have given it updated modern controls, left trigger to aim, right trigger to fire, all that. And then with the Pyramid Head encounter, you've actually got a bit more of a set-piece moment out of that, because they know Pyramid Head, in the wider recognition of the series now, is a big deal. It's only on the hindsight that they've realized people want Pyramid Head as a moment. So they sell it in this game with that sequence, with all the cages, the dangling lights, which is a really cool effect. And they make it into a bit more of a boss fight, even if it's a foregone conclusion how it ends, you know.
Right.
So, and you compare that to the PS2 version, where it was just almost like, oh, you're just sort of stuck in a room with him for a little bit, and then he goes off, he gets bored and walks away. It's a very daft.
So you think that's better?
Oh, it's much better.
Okay.
I'm also, I don't want to rub anyone too much the wrong way on this, but Silent Hill 2 on PS2 has not aged terribly well. MGS3, which I saw at the event, obviously has aged a lot better, and you can translate a lot of the stuff, the game design, the cutscenes over. Silent Hill 2 does need a lot more work, and Bloober Team, I think, realized this. So they've got awkward position. They're in the awkward position of trying to find this balance of changing stuff that necessarily does need to be changed, because the movements and some of the style of Silent Hill 2 doesn't translate. It doesn't quite work every time. It was a very early PS2 game.
Right.
It did need an update, way more. And there's new puzzle segments which flesh out the game. Really well made, inventive puzzle segments that make use of the first-person camera now. There's the combat sequences, Pyramid Head, which works much better than the originals. Yeah, so these are sensible choices, and I'm totally on board with those. But some of the delivery and the combat is maybe not like Capcom level, Resident Evil 2 remake level stuff. So that's a bit of a shame.
Okay, well, I think I lied because I actually thought up one more visual question I want to ask.
Okay.
Which is that the character faces are a source of some controversy. I think the main character's face is not as much of a concern as maybe some of the other people in the game, the side characters. People are expressing some concerns over the way they look, over the way they animate. Did you see any of that in this demo? Or was it just like pretty much third-person gameplay the whole way through? Or
there's a lot of cuts. I mean, I did get to see a few. The cutscenes were in the same place, all rendered in engine, obviously, where they were. Right. Some of them were pre-rendered CG back in the day. I mean, the hair on, some of the characters doesn't look amazing. There's a bit of a straw-like quality to it, which I thought didn't quite sell it as a AAA release. Skin rendering, skin shaders look good, I thought, and in animation they look good, but I think the argument is fair that we have moved on significantly in the last few years in the AAA space in detailing these faces, especially looking at something like Hellblade. Like, you come back from Hellblade and you're like, oh, okay, it's hard to see any other game and be so impressed now, right? Because they're so good at what they do. So it doesn't scream like there's improvement to be made there, I think, in capturing the nuances of facial animation and delivering the emotion through that. And also the character rendering, I think there's a few rough points as well, the hair especially. So Okay.
So I guess closing up here, do you have any quick final thoughts? I mean, to me, I think this is an excellent looking UE5 game. I think it has some obvious image quality faults. Hopefully those can be cleaned up on PC, because it does have a date PC release in addition to PS5. And yeah, I do have some thoughts about the combat and some of the animation, maybe not quite up to par, but it is Bloober Team. They do tend to have very interesting and often high quality, but somewhat inconsistent games. So I don't think that's totally unexpected here. But I think because they are using Lumen, and they are using Unreal Engine 5, and they do seem to have a pretty great art team here in terms of building out the environments, in terms of placing that fog so well, like I mentioned, in terms of building those interior spaces and making them look lived in and worn in and nicely abandoned as well, of course. I think it's possibly one of the best looking horror games ever made. So I guess, do you have any final thoughts on what they've delivered here, or have you pretty much said what you wanted to say?
One final thought is that I do want to compliment the bravery of Bloober Team to actually go out there and add new bits. And I agree, it is a beautiful looking game, especially the environments. And what they have done here is taken the original designs of the original, Silent Hill 2, and kind of had to paint around the edges of what Konami were able to show, because some of the original game was had fixed camera angles. Not all of it. Some of it was navigable with a 3D camera, but segments were fixed. And here you're able to look in every direction, up and down, which wasn't possible before. So they've had to really think and flesh out this world in a way that's faithful to the original spirit of the original. And I think they have nailed that.